Yes, we are talking state laws, and this is a new law just recently signed by our governor, Josh Green, aims to turn the tide on housing crisis in bid to address years-old housing crunch. New laws will force counties to ease density zoning rules. There's some pros and cons to this, Scott.
Yeah, there's quite a bit to the bills that he signed, and the general summary that people should take out of this is what they're trying to do is allow for more density in the state urban district. Now, urban, for what we consider as urban versus land use ordinance, is vastly different. And so the urban district on Oahu, for example, runs all the way up. There's urban land use districts in Makaha all the way up the Leeward Coast, and Waianae, and Haleiwa, and Hauula up the windward side, which are very country areas. And the idea here, though, is to be able to allow more density in those urban classifications. So in theory and in concept, I understand where they're going with this, and I understand, and that's a good thing to be going into a component where you add more density in your denser areas, your urban areas, right? For one, allow more housing, and two, to protect your ag lands and your conservation lands, so you keep the density in a certain area. The problem I have with this is that it's going to ease areas like apartment zoning and allow you to go more dense, which is perfect. That's great. Urban infill is what you want to call it. But where the issue to me lies is that also encompasses residential areas. And now so one of the parts of this is they're trying to allow it to where you can have 2 more dwellings on a lot in a residential area. And that to me is a big problem and a big concern.
Well, what that leads to is, for example, I bought a house back in the early 90s. It's a residential area, single family homes on 10,000 to say 12,000 square feet. What that means is in my neighborhood, which I bought into, people could, again, with permit and county approval, I could build another dwelling in that neighborhood if they allow that. The problem is that that's not what I bought into. And suddenly my neighborhood, well, first of all, the Big Island is just not as busy as your island is. We both know that, right? You guys have that already dense thing. We have so much space on the Big Island, but the impact to a neighborhood is the same, whether it's Oahu or the Big Island. You're basically changing the neighborhood that people have lived in. And before I pass it back over to you, let me just say that the housing crisis is twofold. One is a shortage of inventory, right? And the other one is the pricing of houses has gone up.
Yep.
So
that's what this is designed to help with. I don't think it's going to help it with. I mean, what is your concern with being able to add a unit or 2 units in your subdivision?
Well, nothing if 1 out of 100 homes does it, or 5 out of 100 homes. But if 50 homes out of 100 do it, you're talking about a significant difference in density, traffic, and whether you take that on our scale here in say Waikoloa Village, where I live, we're not heading out to an expressway. We're heading out to a highway. There are more cars already on the Big Island. There's just more people that want to be here, but it's not bad. We don't have the commutes that you guys do. We have the distance, and we have more cars, but things move along pretty smoothly. But inside of the neighborhood, when I go home, you're going to notice the difference. There's going to be more people, more cars parked on the street. So the problem is the same in both places. It's just for you guys, density is going to become, monstrously more dense. So,
yeah. So the issue, I mean, you're hitting on what I see as the concern, because Brian Schatz was talking about, hey, we can't be concerned with aesthetics of the neighborhood. Well, it's not about aesthetics. It's about infrastructure, right? We have this problem here. I live in Kaimuki, Kapahula, Diamond Head, and I have a hard time driving down the street. I have to stop, wait for the person coming the other way to clear, because everybody's spilling out into the street with additional dwelling units, and they're not all on their units. So now it's into the street. And so where I have a brief issue with this bill is, if you look in our urban core, first of all, how does this solve affordable housing? They even said in that bill that we need 50,000 units over the next 5 years to get to the point. So this is a one-off system that you're going to have 50,000 people putting in applications for ADUs and building. Well, we already have a backlog of 12,000 permits with over a year wait to get a building permit. So, okay, 50,000 people go to get an ADU permit to add a second dwelling on the property. All right, now what? It's going to take 5 years to get that permit? So you have a backlog in the system that's not going to allow you to get there, for one. Two, if you look at the urban area of Oahu right now, you have a ton of 2-story, 3-story walk-ups with maybe 10 units in them. All right, well, why don't you go and rather than moving this to the single family area, why don't you first do the infill? If you take, 6 walk-up units of 10 units per walk-up, that's 60 units, and some get affordable housing development in the form of a high rise. Now you've got 600 units in the same place that there were 60. You've actually improved by tenfold the number of housing in that capacity. It's much easier to permit a condo building as one project rather than 600 ADU individual units, right? So that doesn't make sense.
Well, and just to add in real quick so that people understand, ADU basically means additional dwelling unit. Right. Yep. And sometimes it's referred to in Hawaii, or it's commonly referred to as an ohana. Ohana means family. Ohana would be another house on a property. Not unlike on the mainland when people lived on farms, kids grew up, and then the kids would build their own house somewhere else on the 10 acres, and the family would still be close to each other. It's kind of the same concept, but on 10,000 square feet as opposed to 10,000 acres. I'm sorry, 10 acres, not 10,000 acres. 10,000 square feet as opposed to 10 acres of land. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, my example I have over here for concern is, let's say 2,000 people or 3,000 people in Makaha, who on the Leeward Coast, who have an hour commute in the morning to get out of the Leeward Coast. It takes a long time with all of the traffic. Okay, let's go 2,000 people, build ADUs and add density and add more units. All right, so how long is it going to take to get out of there now, right? To me, there's an infrastructure concern that I have that doesn't make sense when you already have the area that should be the solution, which is the urban infill, and you're going into single family home areas with a one-off solution that doesn't make sense with an already broken building permit system. The system needs to change. It's over-regulation that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, our regulation and getting a permit is it's probably one of the worst bureaucracies there is statewide. I mean, certainly statewide in Hawaii, but possibly nationally. And I understand, because people want to preserve, as you mentioned earlier, the conservation areas and the other areas that are not. But there's not that much land that is designated residential either. So it also means people are going to have to change their idea of what housing means to them, because if you can't afford $1 million or $1.2 million, $3 million, then hey, you might have to think about living in an apartment. I mentioned to you earlier that when I lived in Japan 36 years ago, people did not think about buying a house. They were building way outside the city. They would build houses. So you'd have a 2-hour or 2.5-hour commute by train, into your job and back to your home so that you could afford a home, out in the suburban area.
Yeah.
But then people realize, well, we're commuting 2.5 hours to work, 2.5 hours home. I have time to enjoy my home while I sleep. Now, that's just one situation. So that part of people's thinking perhaps needs to change as well if you want to live and work here in Hawaii. So it's a complicated situation. We both know that.
Very much so. Well, I'll give you my example just because this is the other part of it that doesn't make sense to me. Like I just buying a fixer upper for 1.2 million, right? Then I'm going to renovate it, and then I'm going to build an ADU. Okay, well, that once I build that ADU, now can I supplement my mortgage with that? Sure, but that whole property is now worth 1.8 million. That's not more affordable. That's gone the opposite direction. You've actually made it more expensive. Now, are we adding more rental housing at that point? Yes. But the goal should be home ownership. And in Hawaii and in a lot of places now, the concept of how you get into home ownership has changed. You buy into a condo, step up to a townhouse, step up into the home down the road. You don't end up starting out buying the home here in Hawaii. Typically, it's too big of a stretch. So that's that mindset you talk about needing to change. But I would also argue that adding an ADU onto a single family dwelling doesn't make it more affordable. It makes it actually more expensive, and you should be building more condo high rises in the urban infill where there's the space for it, and highest and best use would be there. And then you can add more units to reach that 50,000 at a more affordable cost, and you can put in your affordability restrictions that you want.
Right. And it is indicated in the bill, or at least in the presentation of it, that, it's going to be up to the counties, to decide. However, the state has kind of reserved the right to override the counties, which I don't see as a bad idea. We have a lot more space on the Big Island. There's a lot of space here, and we really could use more. You think, oh, why don't you just build more houses in it? But it's hard to get things started. It's hard to say, hey, we're going to build. So developers, they're the ones who come up against the brick wall of the bureaucracy and go, well, shoot, it's going to take us 5 years just to break ground. I mean, okay, so now we have.
That's the crux of the issue here. It's not changing the zoning to allow people to have more dwellings. The issue is the overregulation. And I'll give you here's the example. In the 1960s and 70s, Hawaii became a state in 1959. In the 1960s and 70s, we were adding 14,000 new units per year, right? And then all of a sudden, the state went, whoa, wait a second. We're going nuts here. We need to regulate this better to have a better plan. And now we're between 2,500 and 4,000 units a year. So they swung the pendulum the opposite direction to restrict the development. And the reality is you've over restricted it to the point that we've got a 4-decade deficit of building the supply that we need to be able to allow people to buy. And in doing so, when you restrict the supply, but the demand increases, prices go up, right? And now we're in this issue because of 4 decades of shortage of housing. You can't just change the zoning laws. You have to undo the over regulation and the over restrictions that are going on here and free that up some.
Yeah, and we're not going to do that just by going down to the state capitol and waving a sign around, stop regulation, right? I don't know. And I will give them this. They're probably understaffed, et cetera, but they really need to push the permit process, especially. They need to get that going because, they gave them to 2026 to implement this. That's a year and a half from now. I can tell you, you're going to be losing a lot of people off your island, off my island, whatever, because it's less affordable here. Now, we're not trying to paint a grim picture. We're just talking about the reality of it. We would like to see that. We live here. We'd like to see that picture change. I'd like to see friends of mine who have been priced out of the housing market be able to get back in. Just because interest rates are going to, there may be some lowering of interest rates. We'll talk about that later. The prices are what keeping people out. I mean, the combination, but we'd like to see it to change. And we're not trying to, again, I'll reemphasize, not trying to paint a grim picture. We're simply talking reality. And we don't think that this particular thing is going to be the answer. So.
Yeah, it's definitely not the answer. And then, and so the bill itself, in the context of what they're trying to do, is good. But then they're putting too much of the emphasis on the wrong locations as a one-off solution. The one-off people, we're not going to provide the supply. It's going to come from developers. So anyway, we're going to talk about that a little more in detail.
Right. And we also, like I said, Josh Green, our governor, used to be lieutenant governor. He is he's an emergency room doctor, so he's a smart guy, and I like him, and I support. I think, again, in theory, this is a good idea. I think it's more of a short-term Band-Aid as opposed to a long-term solution. They really got to go to the bureaucratic side of this and fricking take care of it if they want to, make any progress. Because you can't wait a year and a half. You can't wait 2 years. You can't wait 5 years. In that time, you're going to lose people from the state. So,
yep.